Heave your tired bones off that porch, Thorne, before we do it for you. Sheriff Silas Vance's voice crackled, raw and jagged, aimed directly at the body cams he thought he controlled. You don't look like a landowner, you look like an expiration date. Riot shields locked into a jagged wall of polycarbonate. 67 pairs of boots ground into Marcus Thorne's dry Georgia topsoil. Rifles were angled toward the barn, as if they were expecting an insurgent cell instead of a man who spent his mornings pulling weeds. A deputy smirked, snapping the latch on the kennel door where Marcus's dog lay quiet. Vance stepped into Marcus's personal space, his badge a gleaming weapon. "Eminent domain, Thorne. Progress is moving in, and you're moving out." Marcus's massive hands didn't shake. They stayed locked on a weathered manila envelope. His work shirt was stained with the sweat of a man who had earned his peace, but his eyes were already calculating the exit strategy of every man on his lawn. Sheriff Vance had just surrounded a Tier 1 operator without realizing he had walked into the mouth of a trap. Before we continue, let me know in the comments which state you're watching from, and hit that subscribe button, because what Marcus does next is a masterclass in tactical justice.
The document was 3 pages. County seal on the cover page, embossed rather than printed. Someone had gone to the expense of a physical seal, which meant someone had access to county materials, which meant this had been processed through official channels rather than manufactured entirely outside them. The language in the body was the specific density of legal prose designed to communicate authority without inviting scrutiny. Phrases that sounded precise while committing to nothing. Definitions circular enough to be applied however the enforcing party required. Marcus read every word. He stood at the bottom of his porch steps in the cold morning air, with 67 men arranged across his property, and read the document the way he had been trained to read intelligence reports, not for meaning, but for the gap between what was said and what was meant, for the details that were almost right, for the places where the architecture of a lie left seams. Vance watched him read with the patience of a man who believed patience was no longer necessary. Behind the sheriff, the deputies had begun the unconscious recalibration that happens when sustained alertness meets sustained inaction. Weight shifts, small adjustments, the cold starting to work on them in ways they didn't register, but Marcus could read in their bodies. The younger ones were stamping their feet without realizing it. The older ones had their shoulders drawn up slightly toward their ears. He reached the authorization page, read the signature, read the seal. Then he read the signature again. He folded the document along its original crease, precisely, deliberately, without hurry, and held it back toward Vance. "Eminent domain," he said. "County's exercising its right to acquire property deemed necessary for infrastructure development. Everything's been properly. Judge Carver retired 8 months ago. His successor is Judge Patricia Wills. This seal is Carver's." The word "retired" landed in the yard and sat there. Something moved across Vance's face, a brief involuntary recalibration, there and gone in under a second. A tell, the kind of micro-expression that appears when a man who is prepared for a conversation suddenly finds the conversation beginning somewhere he didn't expect. He didn't take the document back. Administrative lag, paperwork cycles, doesn't invalidate the underlying authorization. "No," Marcus agreed, "but it's a place to start." He held on to the document and descended the last porch step, turning east along the line of deputies, not toward Vance, not toward the cruisers, not toward any of the obvious focal points of the deployment, just walking the edge of his own property with the unhurried purpose of a man taking inventory of something that belongs to him. The deputies nearest him stiffened as he moved. 2 turned to track him. A third looked toward Vance for instruction that didn't come. Because Vance understood, Marcus could feel the calculation from 20 feet, that calling out would concede that Marcus was doing something worth reacting to. Marcus stopped at the midpoint of the eastern formation and looked across the full arc of deployment. From this position, the north gap was clearly visible, not a gap in bodies, but a gap in coverage, a 40-foot stretch of fence line where the terrain dipped slightly, and neither of the deputies stationed at its flanks could effectively see the full stretch between them. Standard deployment protocol for a rural property this size would position a third body in that dip. There was no third body. The two SUVs near the equipment shed were parked at angles that created a mutual egress problem. If both vehicles needed to move simultaneously, or even in quick succession, the driver on the left would have to reverse, cut hard, and then pull forward before the vehicle on the right could exit the space. 40 seconds minimum. In an operation that required fast repositioning, 40 seconds was a different kind of infinity. Marcus turned back to Vance. He raised his voice just enough to carry across the yard. Your vehicle's near the shed. Mutual egress problem. The driver on the left exits first. He blocks the other one for approximately 40 seconds. A deputy near the shed, the driver, from his positioning, looked at his vehicle, then at the other vehicle, then back at his vehicle. Something moved through his expression that he couldn't prevent. Your north fence has a coverage gap. Your two men there can't see each other and can't see the barn simultaneously. Marcus paused. And your transport van. That's enough, Vance said. He had moved. He was crossing the yard toward Marcus now with a different energy, the performance of patience replaced by something less considered, his boots striking the frozen ground with slightly too much force for a man who wanted to appear unhurried. He stopped close, too close, inside the distance that protocol and instinct both suggest. The proximity meant to use physical presence as a substitute for argument. Marcus was taller by an inch and wider by a significant margin, which meant the move landed differently than Vance had probably intended. You done? Vance said. His voice was quieter now, a register that was meant to be private and had the opposite effect. Several nearby deputies leaned slightly toward the conversation. I'm pointing out problems with your formation I'd think you'd want to know. What I want is for you to go inside while my officers conduct their work. What work? County business. You said that. What work, specifically? Vance held the eye contact for 3 seconds. Then his right hand moved, not toward his weapon, toward Marcus's arm, a grip, the physical assertion of authority when verbal authority has found its limit. Marcus looked down at the hand on his arm, looked at it with the same cataloging attention he brought to everything else. Then he looked up at Vance's face with an expression that contained precisely nothing. Not anger, not surprise, not resistance, just observation. The face of a man adding information to a file. That's on camera. My property has 8 recording points. You came in through the gate that has 2 of them. Vance released his arm. The release was controlled, not a flinch, not an apology, a deliberate withdrawal designed to look like a choice, but the order of operations had reversed, and both men understood it. We're going to be on this property for several hours, standard enforcement timeline. I suggest you go back inside and let this proceed. I suggest you get a valid signature on that document before you proceed with anything it authorizes. Neither man moved. From the far side of the property, the south field, where Marcus had planted the season's first crop rows 3 weeks before, came the sound of a diesel engine turning over. Heavy equipment, the specific pitch of a loader, large-framed, hydraulics pressurizing. Marcus turned toward the sound. His jaw tightened, a single controlled response, and then his face went neutral again before it fully arrived. He turned back to Vance. You brought a loader. Infrastructure assessment requires equipment. Infrastructure assessment. Marcus repeated the phrase without inflection, turning it over, examining it. On a working farm. Vance held his gaze and said nothing. Marcus looked south, toward the sound of the engine. The loader was moving. He could hear it in the way the engine note changed as the hydraulics engaged, the bucket dropping, lowering, beginning its first pass. He looked back to Vance. Write down the time, Marcus said. His voice was even, completely even. 11:04 a.m. Write down the equipment you brought, the judge's name on that authorization seal, and what that loader is doing in my south field. He held up the folded document. Because I am.
They took the south field first, and they took it with the methodical efficiency of men who had been told exactly what to do and had no reason to question any of it. The loader moved through the crop rows without slowing. The bucket dropped at intervals Marcus had begun timing. Every 12 feet, a new section of earth overturned, the young plants coming up in clumps of dark root-threaded soil, winter wheat and barley, and the 2 rows of heritage corn that Marcus had grown from seed stock his father had maintained for 30 years, stock that had come from his grandfather before that, varieties that didn't exist in any commercial catalog because they had never needed to. The pile growing near the south fence was not being collected for analysis or relocation. It was being deposited in place, the way you deposit something you intend to leave. Marcus stood at the field's edge with his phone recording. A deputy moved toward him, young, professional enough, doing his job. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back from the active work area." Marcus stepped back 4 feet, the precise legal distance. He kept recording. The deputy looked at him for a moment with an expression that wasn't hostility, but wasn't comfort either. The expression of a man doing a job that he has begun to have questions about and has decided to continue anyway. He returned to his position. Marcus switched recording applications without looking down, his thumb moving on muscle memory alone, activating the secondary app he had configured 18 months ago. It ran beneath the camera function, invisible in the interface, time-stamping GPS coordinates at 3-second intervals, embedding the data into the file metadata, creating a record that was not just visual but spatial, not just what was happening, but precisely where on his property it was happening and when. The 2 plainclothes men appeared at 11:23. He almost missed them. They came from the north side of the field, not from the direction of the vehicles, not from any point that would naturally draw his attention, and moved through the overturned section of the south field with canvas bags over their shoulders and the focused body language of people executing a plan. They were not collecting samples. They knelt at intervals along 3 sections of the destroyed field. Their movements were practiced, one hand pressing into the turned soil, the other transferring something from the back. Packages, small, approximately fist-sized, pressed into the earth at depths that would register as buried rather than dropped. The positioning was deliberate, shallow enough to be discovered by a search that was looking in the right places, deep enough to seem like concealment. Marcus kept his phone steady. His face was a document of nothing. He watched the first plainclothes man move to a second position and repeat the sequence. The second man worked parallel, maintaining 4 feet of spacing, 2 tracks through the destroyed crop rows like a planting pattern. The GPS application embedded every frame with coordinates accurate to 6 feet. When they were done, the first plainclothes man stood and looked across the field. His gaze reached Marcus and stopped. A brief evaluation, professional, flat, the look of a man assessing a variable rather than a person. Then he turned away, and both men moved back toward the north edge of the field. Marcus lowered his phone. He stood in the cold for a moment, with the recording running against his thigh, and looked at the destroyed south field, the overturned rows, the pile near the fence, the places where the soil had been pressed back down over things that hadn't been there this morning. He thought about his grandfather's seed corn. Then he locked the recording application and put his phone in his inside jacket pocket, against his chest. Vance appeared at the field's edge 42 minutes later. He walked with 2 deputies and a purpose that was different from his earlier movements. The performance had ended. This was mechanism. His face had the neutral forward focus of a man executing the next step in the sequence. "We've completed our initial survey of the property." "Survey," he said. "During the course of which we recovered controlled substances from the south field, packaged for distribution." He reached into his jacket and produced a second document, different from the first, newer, the ink darker. "Arrest warrant was issued this morning in connection with the investigation." "This morning, so you came in before you arrived." "Investigations develop in advance of enforcement actions, that's standard." "Which judge signed it?" A pause, fractional, controlled. "Judge Wills." So they'd corrected the Carver problem. He filed it. That meant they had someone in the courthouse with enough access to process paperwork on short notice, which meant the chain of institutional corruption ran further than Vance's office, which meant the federal case, if he could build it fast enough, if he could protect what he had, was larger and more actionable than he had previously estimated. He held his wrists out. Vance looked at him for a moment. Something in the gesture had unsettled him. The compliance, the absence of resistance, the way Marcus was watching him with the patient attention of a man who is waiting rather than a man who is trapped. The cuffs went on.
Marcus counted as they walked him toward the transport van. Not the steps, the crimes. Destruction of agricultural property, evidence planting by two individuals he had documented on GPS time-stamped video, conspiracy to commit fraud in the warrant authorization chain, abuse of legal process, potential federal charges contingent on whether Goliath Mineral Group maintained any federal contracts, which he had reason to believe they did, which would fold everything into a RICO framework that would take the entire structure down instead of its visible parts. 11 distinct actionable offenses by the time they reached the van. Vance opened the rear door. He stood beside it in the posture of a man who has reached the conclusion of something. "You have anything you want to say?" he asked. Marcus considered the question honestly. He looked back at the property, at the 14 cruisers, at the destroyed south field, at the equipment trailer behind which 3 deputies still believed they were concealed. "What's the cobalt worth? Per acre? What are they paying per acre, or is it a flat arrangement?" Vance's hand tightened on the door. The knuckles showed. "Because this land has been Thorne land since 1947. My grandfather built the first structure on this property with timber he reclaimed from a demolished mill 40 miles from here. He broke the south field with a borrowed tractor and a borrowed neighbor and planted it himself in the spring of 1948. That's a long wait for whatever they're paying you." The door closed. The darkness was immediate and total. Marcus sat with his cuffed hands in his lap and listened to the sound of the convoy assembling. Doors, engines, radio traffic, the organized noise of 67 men concluding their operation and preparing to move. He closed his eyes. In the dark, he kept counting. He was at 14 when the van began to move.
They held him for 6 hours before anyone with authority entered the room. The processing was deliberate in its slowness. Each step stretched past its natural duration, each handoff between officers slightly more bureaucratic than necessary, as if the facility itself were running at 3/4 speed specifically for him. Marcus recognized the technique. He had seen it used in other contexts, other facilities, in situations where the people running the delay had considerably more operational experience than a county sheriff's department. Vance had gotten the idea from somewhere, or someone had suggested it. He used the first hour to memorize the facility layout. Not through any deliberate effort, he simply could not observe an environment without cataloging it. 2 camera positions in processing, one in the corridor leading to the interview rooms, mounted at an angle that left a 4-foot blind spot near the door to the stairwell. 3 deputies on the floor during the shift he was processed through, 2 during the quieter period that followed. The duty sergeant's coffee mug was on his left side, which meant he was left-handed, which meant the sidearm on his right hip was a retention holster that required a cross-draw, slower than a standard draw by approximately 0.4 seconds under stress. He used the second hour to sleep. Not fully, a controlled partial descent, the kind he had learned in training and refined in the field, in the water, in the hours before operations where full sleep was impossible and no rest was unsustainable. He maintained enough ambient awareness to hear the door at any approach. His breathing slowed, his heart rate dropped. 14 years of conditioning did not unhappen because you came home to grow barley. He was fully awake and watching the door when Sarah Jenkins opened it at hour 3. She was 38, dressed with the practical efficiency of a public defender who had learned to convey competence through presentation because the system awarded it to people who looked like they belonged. She carried a folder and a yellow legal pad and a pen she'd clearly been chewing on. She set everything on the table and looked at him before she sat down. Her eyes did what eyes do when they encounter something that doesn't match its category. "You're calm," she said. "Is that a problem?" She sat. Men charged with drug distribution are usually one of 2 things, angry or scared. A pause. "You're neither." "I'm working," Marcus said. She opened the folder. Her eyes moved through the document efficiently. She was a fast reader who had learned to identify the relevant sections on first pass, which meant she'd been doing this for a while and had processed enough cases to know where the problems usually hid. He watched her expression as she reached the evidence documentation. The small furrow appeared between her brows. "The substances were recovered from the south field," she said. "They were placed in the south field." She looked up.
by two plainclothes individuals who arrived in an unmarked vehicle. I have GPS time-stamped video documentation of both placements at precise coordinates beginning at 11:23 a.m., approximately 41 minutes before the arrest warrant was executed. Marcus paused. The placements are visible. The coordinates match the sections of field where the discovery was subsequently reported. Sarah's pen had stopped moving. She looked at him for a long moment, the re-evaluation of someone who has walked into a room with a set of assumptions and has had them revised. "Where is this footage?" she said carefully. "Safe." "Mr. Thorne," her voice was measured. "Where specifically?" "Somewhere Sheriff Vance hasn't thought to look." She studied him. Whatever she was looking for, she found enough of it to continue. She made a note on the legal pad, 3 words which she could read from across the table but did not. "Believes what he's saying." She said, "Tell me what you need. Bail as quickly as you can move it, and a conversation that leaves this room." She nodded once, the gesture of someone who has decided to trust a person they have known for 11 minutes, which meant either she was reckless or she was perceptive, and her eyes suggested the latter. "Tell me who you are, actually," she said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. The room had the quality of institutional silence, the specific absence of sound that exists inside concrete and fluorescent light, insulated from the world by the machinery of containment. He looked at the table. He looked at his own hands, still marked from the morning's work in the field. Navy SEAL, 14 years, 3 operational theaters, 2 classified operations I am legally prohibited from discussing the specifics of. He looked up. "I was discharged in 2009. I came home. I have been farming this property, my family's property, for 15 years. Sarah wrote something on the legal pad. "And for the past 14 months, Marcus continued, I have been building a federal case against Dale Vance and the organization funding him." The pen stopped again. "How much do you have?" she asked. "Enough," he said, "if I can access it before they find it." What Vance hadn't found, what Vance had no map for, no informant pointing toward, no county record indicating the existence of, was 40 feet below the northeast corner of the Thorne barn. Specifically below a concrete equipment pad that Marcus had poured over 3 weekends in 2012, working alone, pulling permits for the pad, but not for what was below it, designing the structure so that its visible purpose, equipment storage, drainage management, was entirely credible, and its actual purpose was entirely invisible. He had built it because he understood, coming home from the things he had done in the places he had done them, that the world was not organized the way civics textbooks described, that power moved in directions that official channels didn't always map, that the skills they had trained him into were not things he could put in a box and leave in a storage unit somewhere. They were structural, woven into the way he saw and the way he planned and the way he prepared. He had decided to put them towards something. The bunker was 800 square feet, climate-controlled through a geothermal exchange system that produced no external signature. 4 servers that had been running continuously for 4 years, collecting, processing, and archiving. Every public record touching Vance's office, financial disclosures, property transfer authorizations, mineral rights filings, county commissioner votes on infrastructure projects, the procurement contracts for every piece of equipment the county had acquired in the past 6 years, cross-referenced against corporate filing chains, against the shell company registry that a contact in the state capitol had helped him access, against the financial disclosure requirements that the Goliath Mineral Group had filed with careful omissions with the state regulatory body. He had identified Goliath 14 months ago, following the mineral rights backward from a series of property acquisitions in the county that had no obvious common purpose until you overlaid them on a geological survey map from the state's Natural Resources Department.
The cobalt deposits ran beneath 6 properties in the county, including his. The survey data was public. The corporate acquisition pattern was systematic. The timeline of Vance's infrastructure funding and his bank account activity, which Marcus had accessed through a chain of legal but unconventional means that he had no intention of explaining in an interview room, was conclusive. He had been building the counter case for 10 months, before a single deputy had set foot on his property, before the first eminent domain filing, before this morning. He pressed his hands flat against the table. The fail-safe was the problem. He had built it because he built fail-safes. It was not a choice, but a habit, the habit of a man who operated in environments where the absence of a contingency plan was a form of negligence. The fail-safe was a compiled transmission package, everything on the servers, compressed and encrypted, and pre-addressed to 4 recipients, executable from any device with the authentication credentials. Every device he owned was currently in an evidence bag in a county facility. "Mrs. Jenkins," he said, "bail. How fast?" She looked at him steadily. "Tomorrow morning is the earliest that's realistic. Tonight, if we get very lucky with the duty judge." He did the math. "Do everything you can for tonight." "I will." She gathered her folder and pad and stood. Then she paused. "One more question." "Go ahead." "The thing you said is secured on the property." She held his gaze. "If they find it, is there a way to make sure what's in it still reaches the right people?" Marcus looked at her. He had not told her about the bunker. He had told her the evidence was secure and protected, and she had not asked him to be more specific. She had arrived at the right question through the shape of the information she did have, which told her something about her that the careful eyes and chewed pen had suggested. "Yes," he said, "if I can get to it in time." She nodded, and for a moment, in the institutional silence of the interview room, the weight of what both of them were carrying sat between them, visible, acknowledged, and too large to be resolved by anything that was going to happen tonight. "I'll call you when I have a hearing time," she said, and left. Marcus sat in the empty room and looked at the ceiling and began, in the precise and patient architecture of his mind, constructing the sequence.
You made bail at 9:07 p.m. Sarah had moved through the system with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly which fulcrums to press and in what order. A bail application built on the procedural weaknesses in the warrant authorization chain. A duty judge who was either genuinely impartial or sufficiently careful of his own record to act like it. A bail amount set high enough to communicate hostility and low enough to be constitutionally unassailable. A message, not a barrier. Marcus had seen the distinction before. His property was returned at 9:14. Phone, wallet, keys, the canvas jacket they had folded with the particular carelessness of people handling things that belonged to someone else. He signed the receipt and walked out of the facility into the cold night air without looking back. He was in his truck at 9:19. At 9:31, his phone lit up. He looked at the notification, a news alert, the county paper's digital platform which pushed to subscribers automatically. He opened it and read the headline and sat in the parking lot of the county facility for 45 seconds without moving. Accused drug distributor's military record raises new questions. By 9:45, the story had been picked up by 2 regional outlets. By 10 o'clock, it was on the community Facebook groups, shared with the specific velocity of content that tells people something they are already inclined to believe. He read every word. The fabricated document was good work. He gave whoever had built it that. A DD-214 form, which is the standard military discharge document, with the correct visual structure, the correct field layout, the correct terminology. The separation code was RE3, which indicates discharge under conditions other than honorable, specific enough to suggest, but vague enough to avoid the scrutiny that a dishonorable would invite. The psychological evaluation language attached to it was clinical in the precise way that clinical language becomes when it is produced by someone who has read clinical documents but never written one. The vocabulary was correct, the sentence structure slightly too uniform, the conclusions arrived at slightly too neatly.
There was a disciplinary record, 4 incidents over 3 years, each described in the language of institutional concern, repeated pattern of hostile authority relationships, difficulty integrating into team command structure, episodes of paranoid ideation in field assessment contexts, language designed to sound specific while remaining unprovable, language designed to be believed by people who wanted permission to stop believing in him. Marcus put his phone face down on the passenger seat. He drove home. The property looked different at night, not different from how it had looked last night, but different from how it had looked this morning, before this morning had happened. The tire ruts in the grass caught his headlights as he turned in. The south field was a dark absence where there should have been visible rows. A gate latch on the east fence had been bent, forced and not repaired, because why repair something that belongs to someone you're taking? He walked the full perimeter before he went inside. It was habit, and habit had kept him alive in places where inattention was a final mistake. He checked the fence line, the equipment shed, the barn doors. He noted what had been opened and whether it had been reclosed, what had been touched and whether it had been replaced. The barn was locked. The padlock was his padlock. He stood in front of the barn door with his hand on it and listened to the silence inside for a full minute. Then he went inside the house and called Sarah Jenkins. He answered on the second ring. He had called her a total of 3 times before tonight, which meant she had decided to keep her phone close. He filed that. "You've seen it," she said. "I've seen it. It's already in the community groups. I've had 2 calls from potential character witnesses who are," she paused, "who were considering coming forward." "Were," Marcus said. Marcus. Her voice carried the careful weight of someone delivering information they wish they didn't have. "This is going to change the landscape before we've had a chance to establish the actual record. People in this county, they don't know you well enough to resist something that's presented this officially." Marcus stood at his kitchen window and looked out at the dark field. The moonlight was sufficient to show him the shape of what had been destroyed. He looked at it without flinching. They built it quickly, which means they had it ready, which means they were monitoring the case's development and identified a threshold, the moment when what I have becomes dangerous enough to require preemptive discrediting. He turned from the window. "The warrant chain has problems they know I can attack. The evidence planting has documentation they don't know I have. They needed the public positioned before any of that becomes visible in court." "What do you need?" Sarah said. "The National Personnel Records Center, my actual DD-214, verified and authenticated through federal channels." He sat down at the kitchen table. "I need it on record, and I need it accessible to any journalist who requests it." "That's a 3 to 5 day process at minimum." "I know." He opened his laptop. "They know it too. They timed this so the smear has 3 to 5 days to work before the correction arrives." He paused. "Who called you from the character witnesses?" She told him, 2 names he recognized, people he had known for years, people who had attended his father's funeral, people who had borrowed equipment and returned it, who had waved from the road and meant it. Both of them had called to say they needed to reconsider their involvement given the new information. Marcus wrote their names down on a notepad with the same calm he brought to everything else. "I'm not going to call them," Marcus said. "Marcus." Her voice carried the careful weight of someone delivering information they wish they didn't have. "People get to make their own decisions about who to believe. If what they know of me for 20 years isn't enough to hold against a newspaper story, that's information I need to have." He looked at the notepad, "and pressuring them now makes me look like what the story says I am." The silence on the line had a specific texture. "All right," Sarah said finally. "What are you doing tonight?" "Building," he said. He hung up and opened 3 browser windows and began to work. The fabricated document had a separation code, an issuing authority, a date of record. Each of those elements could be cross-referenced against public military record frameworks, the specific format of separation codes by year, the administrative office designations that changed at documented intervals, the signature block formatting that the Department of Defense had modified in 2007 and again in 2011. The document was built to pass a casual inspection by a civilian reader. It would not survive a documented comparison to the actual formatting standards of the year it claimed to represent. Marcus worked until 3 a.m. By then, he had built a 14-point authentication analysis, a document that laid out in clear and referenceable detail every place the fabricated record deviated from the actual standards of the actual form it was impersonating. He saved 4 copies to 4 separate encrypted locations. Then he looked at his kitchen window at the dark field one more time. He thought about the seed corn, about the specific variety his father had kept, that his grandfather had kept before him, that existed in no commercial catalog, about the fact that you could uproot a plant and it would look destroyed, but the seed bank it came from survived, and from the seed bank came next season's crop. He closed the laptop and went to bed.
Sarah Jenkins had been awake since 4 a.m. Marcus could tell, not from what she said when he arrived at her office at 7:15, but from the particular quality of alertness that exists in a person who has been moving through exhaustion on the fuel of a discovered thing, the brightness that is not energy, but momentum, the kind that stops the moment you sit down. She had 3 legal pads on her desk, names connected by lines, the architecture of a person who thinks spatially about information. He read. He read for 4 minutes without speaking. She let him. She had the patience of someone who had decided that interrupting him would produce a less useful result than waiting. Goliath Mineral Group, Delaware Shell. Registered 2019, no public-facing operations, sole listed purpose is mineral resource acquisition and development. 2 directors, both registered agents, not actual individuals, just professional registered agent services. She stood and moved around the desk, pointing at the second legal pad. Operating company beneath it is Crestline Resource Partners, registered in Nevada. Beneath Crestline, 3 subsidiaries in 3 different states, each with its own registered agent, each with a different listed address. But one accounting trail, Marcus said. She looked at him. That's what the layers are for. Not concealment, distance. You can't follow the money in 1 step. You have to follow it through 5 steps, and most people give up at 3. He pointed at a circled figure on the 3rd legal pad. Where does it surface? She showed him. The County Infrastructure Fund, a discretionary account that existed within the county emergency management budget and that Vance, in his capacity as the county's emergency management coordinator, held co-signature authority over alongside the county administrator, had received 11 deposits over 22 months. The deposits were structured as wire transfers from a consulting firm called Meridian Advisory Services. Meridian's own filings, sparse, minimal, the filings of an entity that exists only on paper, listed a single client, Crestline Resource Partners. Marcus looked at the total figure on the 3rd legal pad, $2.3 million. He said nothing for a moment. He ran the number against the timeline he had been carrying in his memory for 14 months, the sequence of payments against the sequence of county actions and enforcement actions, checking for the correlation he already knew was there. Every significant payment had preceded a county action that benefited Goliath's acquisition strategy within a window of 6 to 18 weeks. The first payment, 18 months ago, had preceded the first informal pressure campaign against the Hendersons, the family immediately north of Marcus, whose land sat over the densest portion of the Cobalt Survey Zone, by 11 weeks. The 5th payment had preceded Marcus's first eminent domain notice by 2 months. He's been on retainer for almost 2 years, before the first formal filing, before any of the families in the survey zone were contacted officially. She paused. Before you. Marcus set the legal pad down. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, not seeing it, running the architecture in his mind. He had built this picture for 14 months. Seeing it in someone else's handwriting, in a small office with morning light coming through the window, made it feel different, more real in the way that things become real when a second person can see them. The commissioners, Marcus said. She was already moving to the 2nd legal pad. Terrence Holby and Frank Deuce, separate channel, a non-profit called the Rural Infrastructure Coalition, also a Goliath subsidiary 2 layers down from Crestline. She pointed to a figure, combined payments of approximately $400,000 over 18 months. Holby voted yes on the infrastructure survey authorization. Deuce signed the letter supporting the eminent domain framework to the state legislature. Marcus looked at Sarah. Without those 2 votes and that letter, Vance doesn't have the institutional cover to run the enforcement operation. So it's not just Vance. It's never just Vance. Marcus leaned back. Vance is the mechanism. He's not the structure. Sarah returned to her side of the desk and sat. She looked at her legal pads, the months of corporate filing chains compressed into 3 pages of fast handwriting, and something moved through her expression that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear, a recognition, the specific feeling of seeing a thing clearly for the first time after sensing its shape in the dark for a while. They know we're building something. The smear tells us that. You don't pre-position a media narrative unless you believe there's a narrative forming that you need to preempt, which means they have something that tells them,
Eyes on the case, inside the system somewhere. Courthouse, county administration, maybe a deputy with access to communications. He looked at her. Don't put anything on email that you haven't said to me in person first. She nodded slowly. How close are we to a federal referral? Close. I have the financial trail, the planting documentation, the warrant authentication analysis, the corporate chain, and 14 months of compiled correspondence and filing records. He paused. But the financial trail and the corporate chain are on my servers, and my servers are on the property, she said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. If they search the barn, they won't find anything in the barn. She looked at him. Marcus, her voice was careful. Marcus, whatever you've built on that property, if they find it before you can transmit what's on it, that's what the failsafe is for. She folded her hands on the desk. Can you activate the failsafe from here, from anywhere? I need a device. They took mine during processing. I have a replacement at the property. Then you need to get back to the property. Yes. I can file a motion challenging the warrant authorization chain, force them to produce the full documentation. It buys time, probably 2 or 3 days before they have to respond. Do it today. There's something else. She picked up a pen. The arraignment has been scheduled. 9 a.m., 3 days from now. Judge Riley. She paused. I've heard things about Riley. What kind of things? The kind that would explain why the county requested him specifically for this case. He looked at her steadily. Add it to the file. He stood, picked up his jacket. At the door, he stopped and turned back. She was already looking at him, pen in hand, waiting. Sarah, everything that happens at that arraignment, whatever they try to do in that room, it's not the end of the mechanism. The transmission is the mechanism. As long as that goes out, everything else is manageable. She held his gaze for a moment. And if they find the servers before you can transmit? Marcus opened the door. Then I'll need to be faster than I've planned. And he left.
He smelled the smoke at 2:14 a.m. He came awake the way he had trained himself to come awake, not gradually, not in the soft ascending progression of civilian sleep, but completely, all at once, every system present and available before his eyes were fully open. The smell was in the room, not the peripheral, slowly arriving presence of something distant, the committed, present smell of a fire that had been burning long enough to fill the air for hundreds of yards in every direction. He was at the window in 4 seconds. The barn was fully involved on the north face. He stood at the window for exactly 3 seconds and cataloged what he could see. The fire had started at multiple base points. He could see it in the pattern, the way the flames were concentrated in separated columns rather than spreading from a single source, the way the upper structure was still intact while the base burned. Not an accident. Arson, professional enough to establish multiple ignition points, amateur enough to work from ground level rather than accelerants distributed through the structure. Someone who had learned arson from instruction rather than practice. The fire had been burning for at least 20 minutes before the smell reached him, which meant the ignition had happened between 1:50 and 2 a.m., which meant whoever set it had either already left or was watching from a position outside the perimeter of the firelight. He was dressed in 40 seconds. He moved out of the house through the back door and went east, away from the barn, along the fence line, low and moving with the unhurried precision of a man who understood that urgency and speed are different things and that confusing them in the dark produces results. If someone was watching, the visible behavior was a man moving toward the road, away from the barn, away from the equipment pad. He used the burning barn itself as cover for the approach to the northeast corner. Even at 40 yards, the heat was a physical presence against his left side. Not painful yet, but substantial, the kind of heat that reminds you it intends to grow. The smoke was directional, moving northeast with the slight wind, and he moved perpendicular to it, staying below the heaviest concentration. The concealed access panel was warm to the touch when he reached it. He went down. The bunker was intact. The temperature was elevated 4 degrees above baseline, well within the operational tolerance he had engineered for, and the servers were running, their indicator lights steady in the darkness. He could hear the ventilation system working slightly harder than usual, drawing cooler air from the northeast exchange point. He had designed the exchange for exactly this contingency, for the possibility that the structure above would generate heat the bunker needed to manage. He sat at the terminal. His fingers were on the keyboard before he registered sitting. He opened the fail-safe protocol from the command line, not from the interface, but directly from the command line, the way you access something when you need to be certain you are actually executing the thing and not a representation of the thing. The compiled package populated in the terminal window. 14 months of archives, organized, compressed, encrypted, pre-addressed. DOJ Criminal Division, State Capitol Field Office. a federal investigative journalist named Pauline Castro, whom Marcus had spent 6 months vetting through her published work and her sourcing practices and 2 conversations in which he had not identified himself, before concluding she was the kind of reporter who understood what to do with information and, more importantly, what not to do with it prematurely. A sealed digital drop that he had established with a contact whose name he would not say aloud in the bunker or anywhere else. He looked at the transmission command. The ceiling above him ground, a structural sound, the specific timbre voice of a building beginning to surrender to forces it was not built to resist. Something shifted, redistributed weight, and a cascade of smaller sounds followed. The temperature in the bunker jumped 2 degrees. Marcus thought about the 6 families. The Hendersons to the north, the Garcias, the Ocasa family, the 3 other property owners whose land sat over the cobalt survey zone, who had received the same manufactured pressure campaign and the same forged documentation and had not had 14 years of SEAL training or a bunker full of servers to help them understand what was being done to them. He thought about Deputy Cruz, 25 years old, smirking in the cold morning yard, operating inside a corrupt system because he had not yet developed the framework to see it as corrupt. He thought about his grandfather's seed corn. He pressed the transmit key. The progress bar appeared, precise, methodical, indifferent to the fire above it. 12%, 23%. The ceiling ground again, more substantially, and something above the northwest corner gave. He heard it as a sequence, creak, crack, the sudden weight shift sound of a structural member failing, and the temperature in the bunker jumped 5 degrees in 10 seconds. He pressed his back against the server rack and watched the bar. 47%. 58%. The ventilation system shifted pitch. The exchange was working against elevated external temperature now, struggling but maintaining. He had overbuilt the system by 30% above his initial specifications, a habit that served him well in environments where the margin between adequate and insufficient was a margin you only miscalculated once. 71%, 82%. The temperature was 11 degrees above baseline, still within tolerance, barely. 94%. The ceiling above him made a sound he had no frame for, not a groan, not a crack, but the kind of settling, the way a very large thing sounds when it has decided to move. 100%. Marcus was out of the chair and at the access tunnel in 2 seconds. The tunnel exited 40 yards northeast of the barn's footprint, a detail he had engineered on the first weekend of construction, recognizing that an exit that emerged inside the burn radius of the primary structure was not an exit, but a trap. He moved through the tunnel at a controlled pace, not running, because running in a confined tunnel after an extended sedentary period in a heated environment produces the kind of heart rate spike that impairs judgment in the moments immediately after emergence. He came out of the ground into cold night air. He turned. The barn was fully consumed on the north and west faces. The roof had partially collapsed. He could see the open sky through the structure in 2 places. The equipment pad area was obscured by smoke. Within hours, it would be concrete rubble under ash, and anyone who searched it would find ventilation remnants and server components in states that would require forensic analysis to even identify, let alone interpret. The servers were ash. Everything that was on them was already somewhere else. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. Sarah Jenkins. He answered. "I can see the glow from my apartment window," she said. Her voice was very controlled, the control of someone managing a response they don't want to have. "It's done," he said. A pause. The transmission. Complete. All 4 recipients. Time-stamped confirmation received before I came up. Another pause, longer. I could hear her breathing. Slow, deliberate. The breathing of someone who was working. "Marcus, they're going to come for you in the morning. Vance's office released a statement 40 minutes ago saying the barn fire is, they're calling it arson by you, flight risk basis for remand." He looked at the fire. The heat reached him in waves, even at this distance. He thought about the equipment pad beneath the rubble, about the access tunnel I'd just come through, about the seed bank, and what it meant that things you build in the right way can outlast the forces directed against them. "Let them come," he said. "The arraignment is still 9 a.m., Judge Riley. I'll be there." She was quiet for a moment. "You sound different." "Do I?" "You sound like something is finished." He looked at the fire for a long moment. The north wall gave as he watched, a slow, decided collapse, the barn folding into itself with a sound like a held breath finally released. "Something is," he said.
The courthouse was full by 8:40 a.m. Word had moved through Harlan County the way it always moved, through the diner on 5th Street where the morning regulars ate before anything else happened in their day, through the church parking lots and the feed store and the community Facebook groups where the barn fire had been discussed in the specific register of people who believed they already understood what had happened. Most of the people in the gallery were not there for Marcus. They were there to confirm the shape of a story they had already accepted. He had been watching this happen for 2 days and had not tried to stop it, because trying to stop it would have looked like exactly what the story said he was. He walked into the courthouse at 8:52 in the pressed shirt Sarah had brought to the motel where he had spent the past 2 nights. He had shaved, he had slept 6 hours. He moved through the building without hurry, and the people who looked at him, and most of them did, found nothing in his face that matched what they had come to see. Dale Vance was already at the prosecution table. He was seated between the county attorney, a man named Briggs, angular and careful, who had the closed professional expression of someone who had been briefed extensively on what to say and, more importantly, on what not to, and a deputy Marcus didn't recognize, young, placed there for presence rather than function. Vance's posture was composed. His uniform was pressed. He was projecting the specific quality of contained authority that men in his position project when they believe they are attending a conclusion. He looked up when Marcus entered. Their eyes met across the gallery. Vance held the eye contact for 3 seconds and then looked away, a deliberate, unhurried look away, designed to communicate dismissal. The body language of a man watching pieces fall into their final positions. Marcus sat beside Sarah at the defense table and said nothing. She leaned close. Her voice was low and even. Briggs is moving for remand. Basis is the barn fire, arson charge, flight risk. He'll argue your behavior pattern indicates a person who destroys evidence and cannot be trusted to appear. He's not wrong about the barn, just about what I was destroying. She almost smiled. Judge Riley received 3 calls from county commissioners yesterday morning. I have the call log, pulled from the court clerk's records, through a procedural disclosure request I filed last week. She paused. I'm going to put it in front of him today. Do it. It may not be enough. Riley's been on this bench for 20 years. He knows how to work within constraints. I know. She looked at him. Marcus, if they remand you before the federal, they won't. You can't know, Sarah. He turned and looked at her directly, quietly. It's already done. Whatever happens in this room today, it's already done. She held his gaze for a moment. He could see her understanding something, not fully, but the outline of it, the shape of the reassurance he was offering, and what it implied about what he had managed to accomplish before this morning. She gave a small, single nod and turned back to the bench. The bailiff called the room to order at 8:59. Judge Riley entered at 9:02. He was 61, deliberate, with the considered pace of a man who had been running this courtroom for 2 decades and saw no reason to perform urgency on behalf of anyone's expectations. He settled, arranged his materials, put on his reading glasses, and opened the case file. State versus Marcus James Thorne, arraignment on charges of... The doors at the rear of the courtroom opened. They opened quietly, no announcement, no dramatic entrance, the particular quiet of people who've been trained to move with authority and without excess. 4 men in suits and 2 uniformed federal marshals came through the door in a practiced sequence, spreading into the gallery aisle in a formation that was deliberate without being theatrical. Behind them, a woman in a dark jacket walked to the center of the aisle and stopped. Her badge on her belt caught the courtroom light. Your Honor, Special Agent Dana Reyes, FBI Criminal Division. I hold a federal warrant for the arrest of Sheriff Dale Vance on charges of conspiracy, bribery, and organized criminal enterprise. I also hold a federal seizure order pertaining to evidentiary materials connected to active federal proceedings that conflict with the jurisdiction of this court. The room did not erupt. It compressed. Every person in the gallery underwent the same rapid internal revision, the recalibration of people who believed they had come to watch an ending and had arrived instead at a different kind of beginning. The sound was a collective intake, a single held breath, the specific silence of an audience watching the stage rearrange itself. Vance stood up. He stood with the reflexive force of a man whose body rejected what his mind had just registered. This is completely out of order. This proceeding has been lawfully... Sheriff Vance. Dana Reyes did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The quality of her attention in his direction was sufficient. Please sit down. He did not sit. One of the marshals moved, 2 steps, unhurried, positioning, and something in the geometry of his approach communicated a set of outcomes clearly enough that Vance's body made the decision his mind was still arguing with. He sat. Agent Reyes approached the bench. She carried a sealed federal envelope and placed it before Judge Riley with both hands, a formal gesture, deliberate, the kind that marks an institutional transfer of authority. He took it. He opened it with the care of a man who understood that what he was about to read would require him to publicly revise his understanding of the room he was sitting in. He read. His expression during the reading was the expression of a man who has trusted the floor of a particular room for 20 years and is now watching it shift beneath his feet. Not collapse, shift, the slow reorientation of something he thought was fixed. Your Honor, County Attorney Briggs rose, rising. His voice had lost its prepared quality. The county requests an opportunity to respond to Mr. Briggs. Reyes turned toward him without any particular urgency. This proceeding is being assumed under federal jurisdiction, pursuant to an active investigation into conspiracy, bribery, evidence planting, and organized criminal enterprise involving the Goliath Mineral Group, multiple county officials, and the corruption of county enforcement infrastructure. She turned back to the bench. All pending state charges against Marcus Thorne are hereby subject to federal review and are suspended pending that review. Briggs sat down. He sat in the specific way of a man removing himself from a problem. Marcus did not turn around. He had been looking at the state seal mounted above the bench since Agent Reyes began speaking. The embossed eagle, the Latin motto, the symbols of institutional authority arranged with confidence of things that believe themselves permanent. He looked at it and breathed steadily, in and out, the rhythm of a man who has been in the water in the dark for a very long time and has finally heard the sound of the extraction helicopter. He felt Sarah's hand press briefly against his forearm. She withdrew it almost immediately, but the gesture carried something. Recognition, relief, the acknowledgement between two people who've been working in the dark together that the dark is lifting. At the prosecution table, Vance had gone still. Not the stillness of composure, the stillness of a man whose body has stopped receiving instruction from a mind that had encountered something it was not built to process. He was looking at the federal warrant in Riley's hands, and his face was doing something that none of his training or his 20 years of cultivated authority had prepared him for. Understanding, arriving too late to be useful, the specific comprehension of a man who built a mechanism and has only now encountered the counter-mechanism that was being assembled around him the entire time. Agent Reyes stood in the center of the aisle and looked toward the defense table. She looked at Marcus. He turned and met her eyes. She gave him nothing. She was a professional in a professional moment, and she held her expression with the discipline of someone who understood that what she gave in a look in a public courtroom became part of the record. But she held the look for 1 beat longer than the situation required. Marcus held it back. 1 beat. That was enough. In the gallery behind him, 60 people sat in the silence of a story they had arrived to witness that had turned out to be a different story entirely, and the sound of the federal marshals moving toward the prosecution table was the only sound in the room.
Spring came late to Harlan County that year. The cold held through March in a way it hadn't held in years, the kind of persistent cold that tests the patience of things trying to grow, that makes you check the ground every morning with your fingers to see if it has softened enough yet. Marcus checked every morning. He was not a patient man by nature. He had learned patience, the way you learn things in environments that punish its absence, but he had discovered that farming required a different kind of patience than operations did. Operations patience was the patience of a predator, still and focused, waiting for a precise moment. Farming patience was something else, closer to faith. The south field broke through in the second week of April. Thin green lines, barely visible from a standing height, threading up through soil that had been overturned and poisoned and left for dead, and then, carefully, methodically, with seed stock he had stored in the bunker alongside everything else, replanted. He had put the first seeds in on the first warm Saturday in March, working alone in the early morning, on his knees in the cold earth, pressing each seed to its proper depth with the same precision he had brought to everything else.
He walked the rows every morning now before anything else demanded his attention. There was more that demanded his attention than there used to be. The Goliath Mineral Group was been formally liquidated by federal court order on February 19th. The process had taken 11 weeks from the date of Vance's arrest, which was faster than these things usually moved, which Agent Reyes had told him in a brief phone call she attributed to the quality and completeness of the documentation he had provided. She said it the way people say things they mean precisely and without embellishment. He had thanked her and meant that precisely too. The corporate unwinding was still ongoing in its technical dimensions, subsidiary shells being dissolved, asset inventories compiled, proceeds directed toward the federal seizure fund, but the operative structure was gone. The mechanism that had converted Dale Vance into an instrument of mineral acquisition was dismantled. Vance himself had entered a guilty plea in January, 7 federal counts. The sentencing was scheduled for June. Marcus had been asked whether he wanted to submit a victim impact statement and had sat with the question for 3 days before deciding yes, and then had written the statement in a single sitting, 4 paragraphs, factual and without performance. Commissioner Holby had pled guilty to 2 counts of bribery and was cooperating with the federal prosecution of the Goliath Executive Board, 4 individuals, 2 of whom Marcus had identified by name in the compiled documentation he had transmitted from the bunker. Commissioner Deuce was fighting his charges in a federal facility 2 states away, which meant he had lawyers expensive enough to make the process long and faith in an outcome that Marcus assessed as unlikely. The fabricated military record had been publicly retracted by all 3 outlets that ran it. 2 issued brief corrections. The third, a regional outlet with a reporter named David Ashby, who had the professional self-awareness to understand what the story actually was, published a 3,000-word feature on Marcus's actual service record, his operational history, and the systematic nature of the smear campaign. The story had been shared widely. It sat in Marcus's kitchen drawer, printed and folded, unread. He hadn't decided yet what reading it meant. He was walking the north end of the south field at 7:40 a.m. when Sarah Jenkins's car turned through the gate. He had come to recognize the sound of the engine, a gray sedan with a cracked rear bumper she had been meaning to fix since November, a detail she mentioned every time she drove to the property and never resolved. The constancy of it had become a kind of comfort, the sound of a person who was consistent in the ways that mattered and unconcerned about the ways that didn't. She parked near the house and crossed the field toward him in her professional clothes, which meant she was coming from somewhere official or going somewhere official after this. He had learned to read her schedule from her wardrobe. She stopped beside him and looked at the new rows without speaking for a moment. "Federal sign-off came through this morning," she said. He kept walking the row. She fell in beside him. "The Thorne Legacy Foundation is officially registered as a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Operations can begin immediately." She reached into a jacket and produced a folded letter, official, sealed. The federal settlement contribution was approved at $1.4 million. That's your opening endowment. Marcus took the letter. He looked at it without opening it. The foundation had been his idea, drafted in the motel room on the second night after the arraignment, in the hours between 2 and 4 a.m. when he couldn't sleep and needed to direct his mind toward something constructive. He had taken a legal pad, borrowed from Sarah, who had left it in the room, and he had written the framework in the same methodical way he built everything, starting from the specific problem, backing up to its structure, designing a response to the structure rather than the symptom. The specific problem, rural landowners faced with coordinated pressure from extractive industry interests, leveraging legal and governmental systems, operating faster than individual property owners could respond. The structural problem, the people who needed protection most were the people least equipped to recognize the mechanism being used against them and least resourced to mount a counter. The solution, a standing institutional resource, legal defense and advocacy, systematic early identification of the acquisition pattern, a rapid response framework that could be deployed before the mechanism completed its cycle. Not broad, not theoretical, specific, replicable, built from the architecture of exactly what happened to him and the 6 families around him, built so that it could recognize itself in other counties, other states, wherever the same pattern appeared wearing different names. Sarah had looked at the framework the next morning and been quiet for a long time. Then she had said, "You wrote this last night?" And he had said, "Yes." And she had said, "All right," in the voice of someone who had adjusted their assessment of a person upward and was not going to make a production of it. "Board meeting is set for the 15th, Sarah said, walking beside him through the rows. "We still need 2 independent directors. I have candidates, but I wanted your input before—" "I have candidates," he said. "I assumed." He turned toward the far end of the row, and she turned with him. The April light was direct and clear, the kind of clear that comes after persistent cold, when the atmosphere has been scrubbed clean by weeks of cold air, and the world shows itself without the soft diffusion of warmth. In this light, everything had edges. "Pauline Castro called again," Sarah said. "She wants to tell the full story, beginning to end." "I know. She's good. She's thorough, which matters more." He stopped at the end of the row and looked back across the field, the thin green lines repeating themselves at intervals, fragile and precise, and insistently present in the cold, scrubbed morning. The destroyed south field, replanted, growing. "Deputy Cruz resigned," he said. 2 weeks after the arrest, yes, Sarah paused. "I saw. He applied to the county road department." Marcus crouched beside one of the new plants and pressed 2 fingers gently into the soil around its base, checking depth, checking moisture, the same check he made every morning. "I wrote him a reference." Sarah was quiet for a moment. You could feel her processing the information, the way you process something that doesn't fit your existing model of a person. "Why?" she asked. He stayed crouched, looking at the plant, at the early green of it, the particular fragility of something that is also, in its way, completely committed to continuing. He was 25 and in over his head, and he worked inside a system that told him the system was legitimate. He pressed the soil gently back around the base of the plant. Marcus stood up. "People get to be wrong when they're 25. The only question that matters is what they do next." Sarah looked at him for a long moment in the April light. "Are you all right?" she asked. Simple, direct, the question of someone who had decided that professional distance was less important than honesty. He thought about the question the way he thought about things he intended to answer accurately. "I'm in my field, growing something." She nodded, accepting that, not pressing it because she had developed, over 4 months and one of the stranger professional relationships of her career, an understanding of when Marcus Thorne had said what he intended to say and when there was more to find if you waited. There was no more. He had said what was true. They walked back toward the house in the morning light, the new rows running parallel to their path, thin and green and multiplying toward the south fence, where 3 weeks ago there had been nothing. At the edge of the field, near the gate where the gravel drive met the grass, a handmade sign had been staked into the ground the previous Thursday. Marcus had made it himself. Plain pine board, black paint, letters cut with a straight edge. Thorne Legacy Foundation, protecting what's ours. Sarah looked at it as they passed. "Simple," she said. "Yes, most things worth keeping are." He looked at the sign for a moment, then at the field, then at the morning sky above the property line, clear and cold and unambiguous. He thought about his grandfather arriving at this ground in 1947 with reclaimed timber and a borrowed tractor, and the particular stubbornness of a man who has decided to make something permanent. He thought about his father keeping the seed stock through decades of changed farming economics and changed markets and the thousand pressures that tell a person person, the old things are no longer worth preserving. He thought about himself coming home in 2009 with a set of skills and a set of wounds, and deciding eventually that the most useful thing he could do with both was to put them here, in this ground, in this community, in the work of protecting the permanent things from the forces that would rather they weren't. He picked up the water line he had left at the edge of the field
and turned back toward the rows. There was more planting to do. There was always more planting to do. He got to work.